Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Riftbound 101. This is episode 5, How to Improve. Today we're going to be covering how to outplay your opponents, how to get better at the game, and how to build up a different way of approaching card games in general, but Riftbound for sure. That's going to hopefully, pay off in the short end, but definitely in the long term. Before we get started though, I really want to thank you because in the past 2 weeks, we've gotten up to 500 subscribers, which I had no idea was going to happen when I put up the first video. So thank you for your time and your comments and taking a look at these videos. So I hope they're going to keep being useful to you. And well, here's hoping we get to 1,000. So with that out of the way, the agenda for today is going to be talking about some broader concepts like playing to your outs and what outs are, thinking about relative position, and I'm going to dive deeper into advantage, which I covered loosely in a couple episodes ago, but I really want to take the time to showcase what that means during a match and how you can read your position during any game. And then talking about things like spot counting and mentality, which really, I think, are skills that you can develop post game that will improve your experience week to week. So, outs are a concept that lets you think through the relative pace of your deck and what you're trying to do, and to sort of match your game decisions to that, right? So, thinking of something like Set the Boss, you will be playing a deck that is often giving up resources to really push through, uh, you know, consistent point gain without waiting and forcing your opponents to do certain other or make certain other plays that try to counter you or get advantage off of you. So the concept of outs with something like that in mind really comes from poker. And in that case, it's thinking through, with the hand that you have, your 2 card opener, and the information on the board, how can you win? What are cards that will come up that will increase your chances relative to your opponents? And if there aren't any, then should you be folding or checking or raising? This concept really made its way to TCGs decades ago, where you sort of apply the same kind of thinking to understand whether or not you want to be winning early or winning late. And if there are, variations of that, like what are your specific outs within that general timeline? And so often, if you think of your outs and they tend to be early, that generally means you're trying to optimize impact or efficiency early on, compressing a lot of point advantage, and it generally means you're the aggressor. On the other end, if it's late, then you're often playing to optimize resource advantage and you are the defender. So something like Aspirant's Climb, which raises the points needed to win the game and is a card that you will have out 1 game out of 3, could be read, for example, as 1/3 of a point later, and is a card that you want to play when your outs are late and match this card's sort of game state, and not something that you want to play if you're trying to win early, which is the opposite of the arena's greatest, for example. So if you're trying to think through outs, you can take a look at energy curves, which we've covered in episodes past. So this is the energy curve for Colin Kaiser's winning set list that just took the Atlanta CCS 10K, I think. And as you can see, this unit plays this deck plays a certain amount of units, most of which are between 2 and 4 energy, matched with a hefty array of cheap spells, and really not anything past 6, which is your 2 of Lee Sin centers. You could reasonably assume that this is a deck that is trying to pressure early and maximize impact from the resources that they have, and is also a deck that is not afraid of losing out on advantages or resources to maximize those points. Conversely, take a look at this MF deck, which was Danny McGeehan's rank 11 finish at the same tournament. This is a list which you probably are right to assume is Aurora, where you effectively have no units that cost less than 5. and that 5 unit is probably like a 6 accelerate in your misfortune captain. And everything else is 7, 9, or even 12 energy. So you are not playing for field early. You are playing to maximize your resources, to ramp into those cards, and even to disrupt your opponent. You are, playing for late outs instead of early outs. And really understanding what your outs are is something that's going to happen through understanding your deck in terms of its static deck list, but also in terms of the matchups that you're playing and sort of where you're situated in the dynamic state of a game at any point in time. So often, whether you are the fast or the slow deck will matter. But if you are playing against another slow deck when you are slow or another fast deck when you are fast, that state can change dramatically very quickly and off of very minute sort of shifts in advantage. And that's really where understanding what your position is becomes extremely important. So understanding who is the aggressor at any point in time, which you can understand as who is in the lead. And this happens through a combination of resources, cards, points, and the general tempo of the deck. And then you have to understand what you are trying to accomplish in terms of what position you're in. So when you're behind, you will often be asked to make risky plays to catch up. So you are trying to find margins in the game, and that means that you will sometimes have to play cards inefficiently or try to draw or try to sort of luck out, right? This is the heart of the cards moment. Conversely, if you are ahead, you're trying to think where can you lose margins and what cards can lose you the game. You're trying to minimize point loss or advantage loss. And so this kind of question is something you can ask throughout a game, and you can definitely ask retrospectively to understand if you made mistakes at any point. And relative speed is sometimes very easy to figure out, so understanding who's the aggressor and who's the defender. For example, you're playing a Kaisa deck and you're playing into Aurora. You really can't beat Aurora with red-blue as a color pair. There are no cards outside of Thermo which can trade with it, and even then, you have to draw it. There's only 3 copies. It's not a guarantee. And if you do take out Aurora, you still have to deal with large units. Versus, Kaisa is extremely fast. You can play her on 4. If you're on Kaisa herself, then you can reasonably cheat it out, or not cheat it out. You can play it on 4, and if you're on something like Darius, you can even cheat it out faster and conquer and draw and get that advantage. If you're the Aurora player, you kind of expect that this is going to be happening because you have no 2, 3, and 4 drop units. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to that 9 energy cost so that you can start playing your Dead Bloom Predators and your White Flames and Mind Splitters and whatever else you're on, right? So you can always have like a bit of calculus understanding like who is generally on the faster deck, but then you should also consider who's on the faster game plan when games are closer. So think through something like this dynamic board state, right? You have to understand what speed you're playing at and what speed your opponent is playing at. So you have 2 pieces of information. You have public information and hidden information. Public info is everything that's on the board. This includes creatures, runes, how many are exhausted or unexhausted, has the champion unit been played, is the legend exhausted or not, and how many cards have opponents drawn or have in their hand. Hidden information, however, refers to the cards that are hidden, that you haven't seen in the deck yet, or that are in hand, but you can reasonably guess but not necessarily know. So this is the kind of board state that you might see, for example, in a Set versus Victor or Darius matchup, right? So somebody's played a Vanguard Captain with Legion, and they have 2 recruit tokens for a total of 5 might, and it's sitting on a neutral location. And you want to go in with your Set and either trade or somehow get ahead of this. If this was all the information that was available, you could reasonably make the choice to go in and burn one of your runes as the Set player if Set is buffed, for example, although he isn't here. So here's something a bit different. So you are on 3 runes, you played Set on 4, and you burned a rune, and you're exhausted, so you have no other spells, and you have to play into Vanguard Captain and 2 recruit tokens. Now, you for sure know that the opponent has a couple of cards in hand, and you don't know whether that's a grand stratagem, which would result in, a loss on your side, or something like a Stupefy, or even a Hidden Blade, or a variety of other cards, which you have no way of knowing exactly what's in hand. So you have to make some choices, and if you are ahead, you probably won't make a rash choice and you'll try to buff ahead and give up a point. If you're behind, however, you might make some rash choices to sort of stabilize. And so at that point, what you're really measuring is, am I comfortable burning 1 rune while the opponent burns 6 energy and 3 runes to play a grand stratagem to stick on the point? And so that's, for example, like a state that you would generally be happy with. But if they're playing something like Stupefy for 1 energy, you would be relatively unhappy to lose your set for just 1 spell that also draws them a card. So you have to make, consistent and thorough guesses about what's happening in the game based on what you've seen. Another example of this would be if you've seen them play a grand stratagem, the chances of them having a second one are much lower, right? So that you would be playing with that kind of information. So when you're trying to consider, like, do I take these risks? Do I commit or not? Do I play safe or am I playing from behind? You want to consider what the advantage that you would gain is. So I spoke, I think in the first or second episode, about card advantage, which is really the idea that you would trade a card for multiple cards or you would generate more for yourself. But there are also resource advantages and point advantages to consider. So you can think about reducing waste in terms of how many resources you're spending or how many runes you're recycling. And also points, right? There's an old adage in card games that the only life point that matters is the final point. Likely, in Runeterra, or not in Runeterra, in Riftbound, the only point that matters is the final point in terms of how far you can push the envelope. So if you can hold an opponent to 6 or 7, you can still win. Now, I'm not saying like always let your opponents get to 6 points before you do anything, but it is a resource that you can play with and that you should consider something to manage as well. So the classic example of a trade or a card advantage trade would be the 1-for-1. So a good example of this is somebody plays a Yasuo on turn whatever they're on, and then they pass the turn with nothing up, and you play Falling Star, and you get their Yasuo. No card advantage has been exchanged. There is a resource advantage, but we'll talk about it in a second. So you've traded 1 card for their 1 card, and that's a reasonable trade to make in general. There's also the 2-for-1. So consider a scenario where somebody's playing 2 Raven Blooms and they're tapped out, and then you play Falling Star. You have taken 2 of their cards for 1 of your cards. That's amazing. You are ahead by 1 card, and you've also probably made some of their other spells less valid by reducing the amount of value that they get from Ravenbloom Student. But then you can start thinking about resources as well. So an example would be somebody plays Darius on their turn and is tapped out, and then you play Falling Star on your turn, and you have expended resources, right? So player 1 would theoretically be ahead on certain kinds of resources like runes, and also knowing that they got you to spend 6 damage for their 5 might. There's also another way to read this, which I should have made another slide, is you will be ahead 3 energy. So they spent 5 energy on their turn for your 2 energy. And there's a question to ask about how much your deck values energy versus runes, and, that's another part of the equation. But generally speaking, I would be fairly happy spending a Falling Star to trade with the Darius, because the Darius will often be at 7 power and can ready and attack multiple times. So it will like eke out more value. So player 1 is technically ahead on resources, but player 2 is also ahead on resources in some ways, and it's up to you to figure out, what board state you prefer in your deck. You can also talk about being ahead on points, right? So for example, the player that player one plays Darius tapped out, and player two, or it plays them to battlefield, and player two plays Darius and cleave to take out Darius one. Well, okay, you've expended a cleave to take out a Darius, but your cleave is less valuable, and now you're also up on points because you've conquered. So you're up on resources by having traded that one cleave for a 5-cost card. More importantly, you're up on points, which puts some additional pressure on your opponent, and will, require crackback of some kind. So you're constantly playing a game where you have to consider, what are the resource expenditures and what are the point expenditures that you're trying to play around. And I think for a lot of slower decks, you can generally make the choice to let players get ahead on points early so that you are ahead on cards, on options, and on general value. And for decks that are super aggressive, think a Jinx, for example, you want to be ahead on points as early as possible, especially because expending cards is also mitigated by loose cannon, which lets you draw 2 cards a turn. So again, it's all dynamic and it all has to do with the decks. Now, the really sweet part about this is what we call blowouts. So blowouts are situations where the swing in terms of point or card or resource advantage can become massive on the back of one trade. So I think one of the best examples I've seen happen is somebody who's on Kaisa playing like a very ill-advised time warp into a green deck that has 4 runes open. Now, if that time warp had been windwalled, that would already be pretty bad. You would have spent 6 additional resource and burned 2 runes for nothing. But if somebody Mystic reversals you, you have spent 4 runes to give your opponent like a 6 energy swing, an additional turn, and they've spent 3 runes, but they're about to get 4 back because they have 2 turns in a row. This is like at the apex of bad plays that I've seen happen, and you should theoretically be trying to mitigate these by considering what your opponent has. You can also blow yourself out, which I've seen happen, for example, in a matchup where somebody plays Icathian Rain onto Volibear, only then realizing that Volibear has Deflect 2, and that Deflect will trigger on each tick of Icathian Rain, meaning that the opponent has to burn 15 runes and therefore can virtually no longer play the game. You can also Mystic Reversal an Icathian Rain and destroy an opponent's field because targets are only chosen after the spell resolves. So there are blowouts that you will inflict on opponents and some that you will inflict on yourself, and generally you want to inflict them on your opponents and not on you, although this stuff happens constantly. So the idea is to learn from these and no longer repeat them. I'm pretty sure the person who played Icathian Rain into a Volibear will forever remember to not play it into Deflect 2 or into Deflect stacking setups. And then what you can do post-game is something that is referred to as spot counting. And this is a concept that you find in Magic, but you also find in online CCGs or TCGs. And the idea is to find spaces in your deck list where you can produce additional equity towards a win for yourself. And so you're counting spots where you would like certain cards in hand, but you don't get them. Or you would like to not draw certain cards, but you draw too many of them. So something you can ask yourself after a game is over is, what did I need to avoid losing that game? Often it'll be something like a piece of interaction, like Defy. You could say, well, if I had Defy, I could have countered that Showstopper, or I could have countered that Hextech Ray or something that lost you the game that's very identifiable. And often these are going to be, easiest to identify in terms of very visible resources. So a good example is card draw. You can probably spot fairly easily if you needed more card draw, or if you needed, for example, more pieces of removal. Then the questions get slightly more complicated in terms of spot counting. So you have to ask, can I fit in the card that I would like to include in my deck without compromising either my curve or the kind of playstyle that I'm trying to go for? So an example of this is Time Warp. Time Warp is a card that you could feasibly think that every deck would be better with it if you just thought of it as, like infinite resource situations. You're trying to just get additional turns. But if you're playing a very fast deck, drawing one card that is virtually unplayable is already bad. But for example, if you're running 2 Time Warp and you drew both of them, you would have had 2 dead draws, which will probably cost you the game. And then you can think about what you have to cut to include it. So, for example, if you want to include certain cards, you might cut cards that you only need for niche situations or that are silver bullets, right? So, Retreat is a good example of a card that oscillates a lot in terms of how many are included in a deck based on what you're trying to do, and especially what tools you have active. So, Retreat tends to be played a little bit less in green-blue decks because you have many defensive tools, and it's one kind of defensive tool, but not necessarily the only one that you have access to. But it is run a lot more liberally in decks like Kaisa because red does not have a good suite of defensive tools. And then, in terms of how you determine how many of each you want, it's really all about repetition. You just have to play a lot of matches to figure out quantities, especially when it's cards that you're sort of thinking like, do I want 2 or 3? So Seal of Unity is a good example. You're going to find a wide variety of lists that run Baited Hook or that are just on Victor and are trying to figure out, like, do I need 3 seals? Do I need 2 seals? And even some wilder Darius lists where, for example, there are no seals being run, which is a whole other discussion. So I would reasonably say, in my experience, spot counting and figuring out like what your deck needs requires, at the very least, 25 to 30 matches. And if you're only playing in a Nexus Knight setting, you might not be getting enough reps, right? You're playing about 3 rounds an evening, or 4 in some cases. And if they're BO3s, you're at most playing 3. So if you're playing one Nexus Knight, you could at most play 12 rounds, and that would mean you need about 2 or 3 weeks of Nexus Knights to figure out how your deck feels. You can also just run it by yourself. This is an activity called goldfishing, where you just kind of draw sample hands and you try to play your hands to see if the deck flows well, which obviously doesn't account for interaction, but it will at least give you a sense of like what you are drawing. So think through that and just like play a lot is the sort of answer. Now, I mentioned equity earlier, right? So equity is sort of your chance to win, or like what you expect your chance to win or your matchup to be like. So spot counting and tuning your deck in regards to spot counting is really the maneuver that allows you to increase the equity of your deck. And I'm very careful to not say that this will increase your absolute win rate. So like if I side in one more grand stratagem, my win rate will be 50% higher against X deck. That's not really how it works. Decks have good and bad matchups, and these cards have a chance of being drawn, which will mitigate certain matchups, but you can never really fully account for that. And this is really like the discussion about like understanding your metagame and your field. And we're going to talk about metagames probably next week. But in like a perfect scenario where every deck is balanced and everything sort of has answers to everything, you would expect that 1/3 of the time you would win, 1/3 of the time you would lose, and maybe 1/3 of the time it's all up to player skill and expression, right? And if both players are equivalent, this would lead to a perfect 50-50 win-lose. That's not how things work. And so often, what you're trying to do with spot counting and what you're trying to do by trading better, by producing resource or card advantage, and really trying to maximize like everything that you have on hand, is manipulating your equity, right? So increasing your chances to win by like siphoning off a lot of that unknown equity by just outplaying your opponent, and then making spot count choices or siding in certain cards that will reduce your lose states. And so you can take certain matchups that are relatively uneven to something that is much more favored for you, although it is much harder to win in matchups where you are heavily unfavored. So if, for example, you ever hear somebody talk about a 60-40, a 60-40 is a matchup that is like very winnable. And when we were talking about mid-range decks a couple weeks ago, the idea is that the mid-range deck has a 50-50 into every deck, and you produce more win rate through your equity. But if you're playing a matchup that's a 90-10, you are going to win, 1 out of 10 matches, and maybe you can win an additional like 5% of matches by teching very judiciously. So all this to say, a lot of the game is going to be out of your control. And so the last thing to think about, which I think is super important and maybe deserves its own episode, is the idea of mentality. And mentality really refers to how you deal with winning and losing, how you understand your own, you know, kind of play and your own habits and your own mental states relative to what's happening. And in general, you are going to see a lot of people at stores who react in very extreme ways or who feel down about certain matches that they really shouldn't feel down about. And that comes from misunderstanding what was in your control and what wasn't. And also accepting what was in your control and what wasn't. And, all the other stuff that I've been talking about so far has to do with adjusting towards that kind of realization. So, your priority should be to increase your capacity to win, and if that's not possible, it should at least be to enjoy your enjoyment of the game. And mentality is really the biggest thing here. So, I study a lot of players and streamers in my day job, and I talk to people who have many, emotional and psychological states around gameplay. And so you find people who get angry, right? They think that the game is unfair, that it's impossible for them to win. You might hear them talk about how a card is OP. You can also see people who are afraid, where they start playing reactively when they should be pressuring just because they imagine that the opponent has an answer to their unit. Even though, for example, it might be a situation where they're spending 6 energy in 1 rune to destroy your 6 energy in 1 rune card, which is just like an equivalent trade. And then there are people who are bewildered at variance or chance, and they're going to say, like, I can't believe they had that card. Like, I'm so unlucky. This happens to me all the time. And chances are you are unlucky, or you were, the requisite amount of statistically likely to not draw the right cards, or your opponent was likely to draw those cards. And that's just a part of the game. And realistically, all three of these reactions do not serve you in improving your gameplay. Understanding chance does, and understanding anger or fear, especially if it's exhibited by your opponents, will help you out a lot. But my main advice for people who I see at stores who are having this is to play dispassionately, right? Like, nothing makes you a worse player than playing angry, and I'm speaking from experience. I don't always play dispassionately, and I can, in hindsight, look back and say, well, if I hadn't overcommitted these resources, or if I'd considered things more calmly, I probably could have increased my chances to win, if not outright won the game. And that kind of perspective on your gameplay and on the kinds of decisions you need to make really comes from the simple realization that you will lose even if you do everything right. So you will trade correctly, and you will eke out value, and sometimes your opponent will just have the perfect card, or you will draw dead for a couple of times, and that's all it takes. And you're only going to get a full picture of your play and what you're doing in a long run. So, like, one Nexus night going poorly does not mean, for example, that your deck is bad. It just means that that evening did not go well for you. And the reason why it did not go well can be things like emotional factors, it can be chance, it can be the relative environment that you're playing your deck in. And so, again, it's all about analyzing what you're doing, trying to understand if you could have eked out more value or more card advantage, or if you needed to be on a different deck, or if you even can be, if you have the money to play a certain deck that an opponent is not playing. And this is like a hot topic, because I think, for example, that the Kaisa and Master Yi decks are very expensive, and Set's price as a sort of deck shell is going up massively since the weekend. Um, but there are decks that are seeing, top 50 cuts at tournaments from champions that were not on the radar even a couple weeks ago. Annie is doing very well. Teemo is doing reasonably well as well. And then there are some heroes that are just not suited for the environment currently. like Garen or Lux, for example. But there are still people finding success on that. And all this to say, like sometimes the thing that you cannot deal with will be the budget, but there are margins to be found on players and on certain deck archetypes, certainly. And so my final piece of advice really is going to be like watch tape, which is really like a sports recommendation. Like you're probably not recording your gameplay, but at least try to think through, when you come back from a Nexus night and you're driving or you're on a bus, maybe take some notes, but think through what happened to you and what you could have done to work differently. And also, consider that the meta and the environment changes drastically. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was convinced that Kaisa and Master Yi were the only two viable decks after the National in Shanghai. And now we've had two tournaments this weekend and with a top cut for set. And at the CCS in Atlanta, I really want to be clear that Colin Kaiser's set deck was the only set deck in the top 32, and it ran roughshod over multiple Master Yi matchups and Kaisa matchups. So people will find new deck archetypes. And for example, if everybody starts being on set and less people are playing Kaisa or Master Yi, that will open the door for other champions that might have cards that are not as expensive currently, which will become expensive. So, try to play the things that interest you and try to understand where you are situated in the metagame and what you can do, and you will improve. It's like I can guarantee you that you will get better and that you will have more success and more enjoyment out of your games. And with that in mind, I'm going to remind you that the next episode on Wednesday is going to be an In Focus episode about Leona, arguably one of the lowest win rate heroes in the current metagame, which is still seeing some really successful top cuts in 100 plus tournaments, 100 plus participant tournaments. So we'll talk about some of that, and we'll set a schedule for some of the next episodes that you can expect to see in coming weeks. Thanks again for the 500 subs, and thank you for all the time that you're giving to the series. I hope this is useful. This is a more broad gameplay video. And if you have questions about concepts in this video or about specific aspects of the game, feel free to put them in the comments below. Have a nice one, and I'll see you on Wednesday.